We are in week 2 of our series, A Tale of Three Kings. And last week, Benji did an incredible job as he talked about one of these kings. He talked about King Saul, someone who started really good, but ended up not so good. And today we're going to be talking about another king that's kind of connected. He also talked a little bit about King David. We're going to talk about another king that's also kind of connected to David. But before I jump into that, I want to give you just a little brief warning. Today's message has some themes, has some ideas that are a little PG-13. So buyer beware. Just want to kind of warn you up front. I mean, it's the Bible, so I mean, you don't have to worry that much, but I do want to kind of give you warning if you got little ones with you, there's a portion of this that is a little PG-13. But other than that, I'm thrilled to jump into this, but we're going to do something a little different. As I tell you this tale of this king, as we work through the story of this person's life, we're going to do it in reverse order. So we're going to start at the end and work our way back to the beginning of where it all started. So it'll be a little different. There's a movie that was made back in the late 90s. Has anyone seen the movie Memento? Anyone seen that Christopher Nolan movie, the guy that did Inception? Both of you, awesome. It's a really trippy movie, and if you ever have watched a movie and at the end you're like, wait, what? Like, this movie is that on steroids. It, like, the very first scene of the movie is the last scene, and then it clips to like the first scene in the movie, and then like the scene before the last scene, and it keeps like going back and forth, and it leaves you kind of like asking questions, and even at the end you're like, oh, wait, huh? You know that? So my hope is that though we're working backwards, I don't do the same thing with you. So hopefully by the end of this, you're not going, Dan, I had a great trip, but I had no clue where we went. Like, I don't know where you're going with this. So hopefully you're able to kind of track with me as we work backwards through this story. So story begins, the scene opens up, and we see King David, who is absolutely distraught. I mean, David is undone, one of the greatest kings of Israel, and you can imagine he's on the ground weeping, completely undone. I mean, something has happened so tragic that David can't even get himself together. So much so that there's a prophet that has come and is confronting David, is challenging him. I mean, just laying into David for the state of mourning that he's in. Now, here's the thing. If you grew up in the church, if you have a little bit of church background, there might be some things like some flags kind of going up, and you're like, I think I remember something in David's life about a prophet confronting him. This isn't that moment, if you're thinking of that moment. That moment was with the prophet Nathan, and another time in David's life confronted David over some adultery that he had committed and covered up through a murder, and he's confronted by this prophet, and David's just undone. This isn't that moment. In fact, this is much later in David's life. Last week, Benji talked about King Saul. This is long past. Saul is dead. David has been king for 30 years, ruling over Israel. And this is later in David's life. So the scene opens up and we see David absolutely distraught. And this other prophet, his name's Joab. He's the commander of David's armies. And in fact, one of David's closest friends. And he is just laying in to David. And here's what he says. Then Joab went to the house of the king, this is David, and said, "Today you have humiliated all your men who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you and hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. No, go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come on you from your youth till now." As we see Joab just laying into the king, it's like, what do you think you're doing? Like, here you are weeping and mourning. We just risked our lives for you, David. Some of our men gave their lives to save you and to save this kingdom. And you care more about Absalom than you do your own men. Which kind of brings this question as we're discovering what's happened, as we're working back through the scenes, and we're all wondering, well, who is this Absalom character that apparently David cares so much about? Well, Absalom is one of David's sons. And apparently, Absalom has been killed. So we could understand a little bit why David would be distraught, but it seems like the degree of David's unraveling is greater than just this loss. I mean, for whatever reason, Joab is acting as if this shouldn't be a big deal. Joab isn't acting like someone confronting someone who's lost their son. He's confronting someone that shouldn't be this upset. For whatever reason, Joab is confronting King David, and David is just undone. Well, what's happening is Absalom is the son of King David. He's one of David's son, and Absalom has just led Israel's army out to fight against King David. Absalom was commanding Israel's army as they fought against the king. Which brings us this interesting question of, then why is he fighting a war with Israel? I mean, isn't David king? I mean, he's King David. Why would David be fighting with a small group of warriors, his closest fighters? Why would he be fighting against the whole army of Israel? This kind of leaves us with some questions. And then also this other question begging to be asked is, how and why did Absalom die? You know, what's going on here? As we discover more layers of this story, we're kind of wondering what's happening here. We're wondering why is David having to fight against his own army? I mean, what's happened that David is having to fight this war in the first place? Well, what's happened is Absalom has taken over the throne. He's overthrown King David, and David ran for his life and ran from the kingdom. Which you would think, if you're looking at Absalom, that would be enough. If you wanted to be king someday, and you pulled it off, however you did it, you ended up king over Israel, and the former king, David, your father, runs for his life. Shouldn't that be enough? I mean, shouldn't that be just fine? Like, you got what you wanted, Absalom. Why fight a war with your father? Obviously, as we're looking at this, there's some things going on. There's more to it in the story. We can tell that something has happened with Absalom and with David, that Absalom would be doing something like this. In fact, not only did Absalom want to lead a revolt against his father, he wanted to see David killed. So Absalom, the son, is trying to kill his father, but that's not enough. In fact, Absalom wants to rub it in, wants to show as much disrespect and disregard for his father that he can. And he brings some counselors around him in Israel, and he says, how can I show as much disrespect for the former king, my father, as possible? And one of those counselors tells him this. Ahithophel told Absalom, go and sleep with your father's concubines, the ones he left to tend to the palace. Everyone will hear that you have openly disgraced your father, and the morale of everyone on your side will be strengthened. So Absalom pitched a tent up on the roof in public view and went in and slept with his father's concubines. I mean, this is like Jerry Springer and Game of Thrones combined, right? Like, this is like, there are some serious issues in this family, right? Like, what is going on that Absalom would go so far as to disrespect his father and let the whole kingdom know about it? What's going on? And then this greater question of like, how did Absalom become king in the first place? I mean, what happened that Absalom would be anointed king? Because in Israel, there's this whole process to becoming king. Someone just doesn't declare that they're king. They've got to be anointed by other prophets as king. You can read in 2 Samuel, I believe it's chapter 16, the particulars of how Absalom pulled this off. What he did, there was this trick, and he did these different things, but he became king. But what's more important to me is how he earned the favor of Israel. Because it's one thing to just pull it off, but it's another thing to be able to walk it out and to come back to Jerusalem as king and to rule as king, and David flee for his life. So somehow Absalom has won a lot of favor within Israel. The question is, how did he do that? And we can read how he did this in 2 Samuel chapter 15. It says this of Absalom. Each morning he, Absalom, would take up his post beside the road at the city gate. When anyone showed up with a case to bring to the king for a decision, Absalom would come and call him over and say, where do you hail from? So Absalom's kind of posting up by the city gate, and people are walking in to bring something to the king. And Absalom says, hey, where are you from? I'd love to talk real quick. Where are you from? And the person would reply. And the answer would come, your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel. Then Absalom would say, look, you've got a strong case, but the king isn't going to listen to you. Then he'd say, why doesn't someone make me judge for this country? Anybody with a case could bring it to me, and I'd settle things fair and square. So Absalom's listening to their case, and he's saying, where are you from? Tell me what's going on. Why are you coming to the king today? And they'd present their case to the king, and as Absalom would listen, he'd act distraught and say, you've got a great case. It's too bad the king is too busy for you. He's not going to hear you. If I were king, if I were made judge in this area, I would hear you. I'd be able to judge fairly. In fact, I'd side on your favor, but I'm not king, so I guess I can't fix that. You know, it's like in our politics, many times the people running for offices have all the great ideas, right? Like if you ever, like they're gonna fix everything, you know? It's real easy to say you're gonna fix everything, Absalom, when you're not king, right? And Absalom's telling him, listen, I want to fix this for you. If I were judge, if I were king, I'd fix it, but I can't. In fact, it goes even further. Absalom goes even further. Whenever someone would treat him with special honor, he'd shrug it off and treat him like an equal, making him feel important. Absalom did this to everyone who came to do business with the king and stole the hearts of everyone in Israel. So they'd come and they'd bow, or they'd maybe go to give Absalom something. He'd say, no, we're equals, we're friends. You don't have to treat me like that. Sure, the king needs that, but I, Absalom, I don't need that. And in doing so, day after day after day, Absalom won the hearts of the people in Israel, so that when it came time to pull off his coup, when he became anointed as king over Israel, Israel rejoiced. And by showing his power and authority, he asked, I don't want to just rule, I want David dead. I want to show as much disrespect for him as possible. It begs this question of why? Why would Absalom do this to his father? I mean, is Absalom just a wicked guy? Is he just the bad guy, the nemesis in this story? No, it's much bigger than that. Absalom is much more complicated than that. It's not just this clear-cut good guy, bad guy situation. See, Absalom has some very serious contentions with his king. There's some serious problems that have happened. In fact, to understand this last part of the story, this is kind of the final puzzle piece to understand what's happened in Absalom's life that has brought him to this point where he has so much rage and hatred and contempt for his father. And this final part of the story, it doesn't start with Absalom. It actually starts with Absalom's brother, a man by the name of Amnon. See, Amnon was half-brother to Absalom, and Absalom also had a full sister named Tamar. Tamar, one of the princesses in the kingdom, was known as being incredibly beautiful. And Tamar and Absalom had a special close relationship, the two of them. And Amnon, who was half-brother to Absalom and Tamar, fell in love with Tamar, to the point that he finally confronted Tamar. And we read, as we read this story, that Amnon raped Tamar. And right afterwards became disgusted with her and sent her away. Tamar, absolutely devastated and distraught, ran to Absalom and told him what happened. He was furious. He couldn't believe this would happen in the kingdom of Israel. He couldn't believe this would happen to his sister. He couldn't believe this would happen at the hands of his half-brother Amnon. And we find out that because of this, he burns with rage. Absalom quit speaking to Amnon, not a word, whether good or bad, because he hated him for violating his sister Tamar. He hated out all this rage towards Amnon. Now I want you to imagine for a moment King David. King David is a warrior king, someone who is obsessed with justice and righteousness. And you find out that one of your sons did this to one of your daughters. I mean, you can imagine how furious he would be, the consequences in his kingdom for this to happen. We read what happens next with David. David heard the whole story and was enraged, but he didn't discipline Amnon. David doted on him because he was his firstborn. So David finds out what Amnon, his firstborn, has done, and he's furious with Amnon, but he refuses to do anything about it. Now it's shocking that David would do this, that David would do nothing. I mean, David knows what it's like to be rejected by your father, to feel injustice at the hands of your father. His own father, when another prophet came and said to David's father, one of your kids is going to be king in Israel, bring all of your sons to me. He brought all of his sons except for David. See, David knew what it was like to be treated poorly because of birth order. And yet, David responds this way. And Absalom will never forgive Amnon nor David for this. Absalom, for 3 years, burns with anger over this situation. He doesn't speak to Amnon. He doesn't have anything to do with him, good or bad. He just burns with rage and anger, waiting to get his revenge. And that's what happens 3 years later. He has his brother Amnon murdered. He pulls off this trick and is able to have Amnon murdered. And he runs for his life, not knowing what's going to happen to him. He runs out of the kingdom. And word gets back to David over what's happened. And not only do they tell David what has happened, that Absalom had Amnon killed, but they also tell him why. This happened, They're talking to David because of Absalom's outrage since the day that Amnon violated his sister Tamar. Eventually, Absalom had had enough. He pulled off his plan, and David finds out. Now, David finds himself, imagine being David, he realizes because of his own action, of his own inaction rather, that now he's lost his son Amnon. He's lost relationship. He's lost his son Absalom as he's ran off. And I'm sure he's lost all relationship with his daughter Tamar. I mean, how distraught King David must be at this point. And we find out as we continue to read that David longs to have his son Absalom back in the kingdom. He's gone for years and he just wants his son back. Probably deep down he wants to reconcile but doesn't really know how. And Joab, that commander we talked about earlier, one of the closest people to David, finds out. Joab says, I'm gonna make this work. And he goes to Absalom and he convinces Absalom to come back, that he'll be safe. He convinces him to come. And when he talks to David and says, I've convinced Absalom to come, there's obviously some conflict still in David's heart. And this is how David replies. He says, he may return to his house, but he's not to see me face to face. So Absalom returned home, but was not permitted to see the king. Absalom lived in Jerusalem for 2 years, and not once did he see the king face to face. For 2 years, he doesn't see his father's face. He's told, hey, your father wants you back into the kingdom, and he comes back hoping maybe for some reconciliation, maybe for something to be said. And for 2 years, he doesn't see the face of his king. And it's at this point that he realizes that this relationship will never be reconciled. The wrong that's been done against Tamar will never be righted. And he realizes at that point he must take justice into his own hands. He must do something about it. And that's where the seed of bitterness and hatred begins to grow. It leads to Absalom's rebellion, the disrespect of his father, to overthrowing him, and eventually to trying to kill him and lead the Israelite army out against his father. So let's recap. Let's go back and understand what's happened. Here's a little bit of what happened. So Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar. Absalom is furious. He's angry, and he wants his king to do something about it, but in return, David does nothing about this. For this, Absalom is furious, and he plots for years and eventually has his brother Amnon killed, and Absalom runs for his life. See, David says he wants to be reconciled, and Joab pulls this off and brings Absalom back. But even when Absalom returns, David never reaches out to Absalom. He never ends up reaching out to him. And eventually, Absalom is so angry, so bitter, that he builds up a rebellion and leads a rebellion against his father, and his father has to flee for his life. To add insult to injury, Absalom disrespects and insults his father by sleeping with his concubines. And that's not enough. He wants his father dead. So he leads the entire Israelite army out against David. And during this battle, during this war, eventually David's men kill Absalom. And we find ourselves as David is mourning after having lost nearly everything. And this is where we started the story, at this moment where David has lost everything. You might listen to this and you might go, man, this is crazy that this is even in the Bible. And I'd say, yeah, I know, there's crazy stuff in there. You should check it out. Like, this is unreal that we have this story like this. This tale of Absalom, this tale of one of Israel's kings, it's a tragic story. It's one full of heartache and tragedy. One that didn't have to happen. That had at any point along the road a David come to his senses. If he had done something about this injustice, if he had confronted Amnon, if he had done something to stop it, if Absalom would have dealt with the interior work in his life, the hatred, the contempt, the rage, if he would have done something, maybe this story could have ended up different. See, and that's what I really want to talk about today. That's the big idea behind today, that really there's this great quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson. It says, what lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us. Your past, those things that lie behind you, your future, dreams, hopes, desires, the things that lie before you, both of those are tiny matters compared to the things that lie within your heart. The seeds that you allow to grow inside your heart, inside your soul. If unchecked, those things will end up working their way out. They do every single time. We've got to understand that our interior life always works its way out to our exterior life. Every time. Oh, you can think that you can push it down. You think that you can hide it. You think that you can just go on to what's next, and what's down there, you'll just deal with it. You'll get past it. You're strong enough that you can make it on your own. Every single time, it'll work its way out. Every single time. And what I see so many people doing is those issues within their heart, those things that have happened, those pains of their life, they push those down and they strive for what's next. Right? They have these dreams, these ambitions, these goals, and they think that, listen, if I just achieve, if I just move on to what's next, then I'll be fine. Listen, I want you to know we need to understand that dreams, plans, vision, and ambition, those things aren't bad, but they are never substitutes for dealing with the pain of life. Ambition will never substitute dealing with the issues in your heart. Reaching for what's next will never fix it. In fact, this week, I talked to an individual that wanted to plant a church. So he reached out and talked to me, and he told me about his life story. He told me all these things that had happened, and then he went on, he told me about all of his dreams and his desires and what the church was going to be like and all of his plans and all these things. And when he told me, I listened, and I listened to the tragedy in his life story. It was full of abuse and heartache and rejection and pain. And then it seemed he skipped right over it as if the balm of healing would be ministry, of doing the next thing, of vision. And I told him, I said, have you ever thought about maybe putting that on hold just for a moment? Have you ever thought about maybe seeking some counseling, of talking to someone about these things before you dive into what's next? And he acted like I didn't know what I was talking about. He acted like, why would you suggest that? No, I've got these dreams, I've got these desires, and he just moved on. And all I could think after we talked is, man, that church is going to be one full of hate. It's going to be one full of pain, of anguish. He's going to be doing ministry out of what he doesn't want to be. What's happened, it's going to be coming out of this place of pain, and it's always going to work its way out. I've got so many friends that have lost marriages, that have lost ministry, that have lost relationship with children because they didn't deal with the stuff on the inside of their heart. Because they reached for what's next. Because they thought that busyness was going to be enough, that would push down those emotions, that they could ignore those things and move on to what's next, and everything would be just fine. Peter Scazzaro, author of a few books, one incredible book called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, he said this. He said, ignoring our emotions is turning our back on reality. Listening to our emotions ushers us into reality, and reality is where we meet God. Saying, listen, when we just ignore those emotions, we're ignoring the very place that God wants to meet us. So many times we just think that we're in this rush, that God is in this rush to get us through something, to get us out of something. Maybe, just maybe, God wants to meet you in the middle of that pain. Maybe he wants you to learn something from where you are now. Maybe that's the most important thing that you could take away. My challenge is lean in. Don't ignore those emotions. Don't just skip past those places of pain. Deal with that, because if you don't deal with it now, someone will deal with it later. Either you will or someone in your life will, because it'll work its way out. We are not islands. I love what Parker Palmer said. He said this, he said, self-care is never a selfish act. It is simply good stewardship of the only gift I have. The gift I was put on earth to offer others. Anytime we can listen to true self and give it the care it requires, we do it not only for ourselves, but for the many others whose lives we touch. He's saying that no man is an island. He's saying, listen, this is for you, but it's not just for you. That your life touches other people, and the greatest gift you have is who God created you to be. And if you don't deal with the interior work of your life, you won't be able to offer that gift to other people. Saying that you need to do a little self-care. And that's not selfish. You're doing that for other people. God wants to meet you there. But in our culture, we're taught the exact opposite, right? We're taught to always put on our game face. Always act like we've got it together. We put the filters on Instagram and we put the filters in our life. And we're good. We've got this. We don't need anyone. We're lying to ourselves. We're only hurting ourselves. See, I hope today you're challenged. I hope today you're inspired to do something about it. But that's the thing, I want you to actually do something. If we read accounts like this, if we hear this tale of King Absalom and we don't do anything with it, we're only fooling ourselves. So you might be asking, okay, Dan, fine. Well, then what do I need to do? What is it that I need to do? I want to make this really practical, really easy. First, I want you to tell someone. Just tell somebody. So there's some things in my heart, there's some things in my life I've never really dealt with. See, James, the brother of Jesus, he said, listen, confess your sins one to another so that you might be healed. He's saying, my brother Jesus, he took care of the forgiveness thing, right? Like he has that. But do you want healing in your life? The only way that's going to come is through confession one to another. He's talking about sin, but it's bigger than that. If you need healing in your life, that comes by talking to someone. Some of the most healing, helpful words you'll ever hear are me too. I understand. I'm so sorry. See, we need to open up and to let people in. And then tell someone, but some of us, maybe that's enough. Maybe just starting the conversation of dealing with the pain and the issues in our life, maybe that's enough. But there's some of you that need to take another step. Some of you in this room, you need to seek some counseling. You need a professional that's been trained on working through these issues and asking you questions that you wouldn't naturally ask yourself. And when you want to just kind of squeeze past something, if you just want to cruise past something, they say, no, let's go back to that. And you said that. What do you mean by that? Why don't you talk about that a little bit more? How does that make you feel? See, that push us into that they don't let us just skip past the pain. Some of you need a professional to talk to. And you know what? I don't mean to busy his calendar, but we've actually got someone on staff here that is a licensed counselor that would love to meet you with you. This is a service that we as a church provide to you for free. So like the excuse of like, oh, I don't have the money for a counselor. Yeah, you do. Free is cheap. So some of you, the greatest thing you could do is email the church and say, I'd love to set up a meeting with the counselor. His name's Dino Norfie. He was the one that spoke just 2 weeks ago. You can email in, you can go to the info center and say, I'd love to set up an appointment with Dino. How do I do that? Some of you need some counseling. The Bible tells us, there's an ancient proverb that says that wisdom is found in the counsel of many wise people. That we need to go to people that are wise, that have been there before, and they can give us some good next steps. And then, this one's important, then once you do, listen and actually follow through. You'd be shocked at the amount of times I've talked to someone and said, maybe you need to do this. Maybe you need to work towards forgiving that person. Maybe you need to go apologize. Maybe you need to stop going to that place, quit doing that thing. And I meet with them weeks later and I ask them about it and they're like, oh, no, I haven't done that. It's like, oh, well, that'd be a good start. See, sometimes the things we hear in counseling, the things we hear from these close friends, sometimes those things can be painful. Proverbs tells us that the wounds of a friend can be trusted. There's this incredible counselor that I knew that I worked on staff with in Austin. And I loved, he had this kind of this motto, and he said when he was counseling people, what he tried to do is he'd hit the people in the mouth but not make them bleed. Kind of like that. It's like, I don't want to hurt people. I don't want to injure people. But sometimes people need a wake-up call. Sometimes people need to hear things that might be a little painful to hear. But I want it to be a safe environment that they can process through that pain, that they can work through that. And then the last thing is really just me reiterating what I already said before. Listen, we need to allow others to help bear your burdens. Allow other people into your life. See, so many times we think, no, I'm strong enough, I'm fine, Dan, I've got this. Since strength isn't not needing anyone, strength is knowing when you do. Strength is knowing I'm weak right now, I need some help. Strength is confessing I'm not okay and I need someone to help me. See, we want Icon Church, we want this to be a church where it's okay to not be okay. It's just not okay to stay that way. to ask people in, to bear each other's burdens. Paul wrote a letter to the church in Galatia, and he told them this. In Galatians 6:2, he said, bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. He said, you want to fulfill the law of Christ? Then bear one another's burdens. But here's the thing. I can't bear your burdens if you won't let me. This church you can't bear one another's burdens if we don't let other people do that. If we don't let people in, if we don't take the mask down and ask people to help us, we can't bear each other's burdens. We won't be able to fulfill the law of Christ unless we let people in. But it starts with this realization that we actually need to do something about it. So many times we fly through life and we never really think about those deep things in our heart. Those wounds that have happened or a lifetime of pain. And we want to skip by it because it's not always fun. It requires diving into some painful areas. But it comes with this realization that what lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny, tiny matters compared to what lies within us. When we realize that what's on the inside matters so greatly because it's going to work its way out. We make that realization, we decide to take a step, we can begin to get some healing in those areas. And I think if David were here right now, he would look at you with sobriety in his eyes. He'd say, deal with the issues of your heart. Deal with your past pains, with the junk that's happened. Deal with it, trust me. I've learned from experience that it always works its way out. Learn from this tragic tale of Absalom. If we don't deal with what's on the inside, it's going to work its way out. And it will affect you. And it will affect those around you. So for your sake, for their sake, let's do the hard work of diving into that and dealing with the interior life. In a moment, I'm going to pray, and the band is going to play a couple songs. And I want to encourage you during those songs to think through what it is that you need to do. Maybe for you, you need to tell someone. Maybe for you, you've told someone, you've said, yeah, I need to talk to somebody about this, but you've never actually done it. Maybe the most spiritual thing you could do today is send an email into the church, send an email to Dino and say, hey, could we set up a time to talk? But whatever we do, let's take a step forward. Amen? Let's pray.